academic initiative, which recognizes Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning, and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we're delighted to host Dr. Charisma Acey. Charisma is Associate Professor and Arcus Chair in Social Justice and the Built Environment in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on environmental justice, urban sustainability, and equitable access to basic services in cities. Dr. Acey's work spans the Americas and Africa, addressing issues such as climate vulnerability, access to clean water and safe sanitation, women's empowerment, and urban agroecology. Dr. Acey holds a PhD in urban planning and a master's in public policy from UCLA. She's a UW-Madison Health Equity Leadership Institute scholar, and her work's been recognized with awards for excellence in community-based scholarship. Dr. Acey's publications appear in journals such as World Development, Landscape and Urban Planning, and the Lancet Global Health. Charisma's talk today is Urban Environmental Marronage, Connecting Black Ecologies from Coastal Nigeria to the American South. Charisma, a Zoom-tastic welcome to Cities at Tufts.
Thank you so much, Julian, for that wonderful introduction. And I wish I could be with you all today. I understand there's a watch party where there's some good food. Please eat and drink for me. But I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about the research that I've been doing in Nigeria and some of my new thinking, connecting it to an emerging scholarship in the field of Black geographies called Black Ecologies. And within that, a focus on marronage, which I'm going to get into. What is this term, marronage? So today we'll be exploring that concept of urban environmental marronage and connecting Black ecologies from coastal Nigeria to the American South. We'll examine how marginalized communities create spaces of autonomy and resistance within cities and adapt to environmental challenges, and drawing parallels between historic maroon communities and their practices and contemporary urban struggles. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly go over what we'll cover today. So I wanna get into a little bit more of the conceptual grounding in this term, marronage, and specifically urban environmental marronage. And then talk about what are the transnational connections that I see. Why do this? Why put Nigeria and the American South into context, or into conversation? And then go into depth with some case studies from coastal cities in Nigeria, from Badagry, a former slave port, where we'll look at cultural preservation as a resilience strategy, to Lagos, Nigeria, where you have, at the same time, a mega city, kind of the size of Manhattan, being built off the coast, where they're doing a lot of land reclamation from the ocean, and building a city for the elite, versus massive informal settlements and people living, building their own housing because of neglect by the state. And then we'll go to the Niger Delta, where the very region of the country that drives the economy, the oil producing region, is one of the most impoverished, and how environmental justice struggles there and alternative socio-ecological practices form part of contemporary marronage strategies there. And then we'll put those three cases in conversation with marronage and maroon ecologies in the American South, and then conclude with some remarks on what are the implications for urban and environmental practice. All right, so let's talk about what is marronage. So the term maroons, which you'll hear in the literature, refers to enslaved Africans who escaped slavery in the New World to create independent groups and communities on the outskirts of slave societies. So historically, it refers to this creation of autonomous communities who escaped bondage. And they often formed independent settlements in remote, very difficult to access terrains like mountainous regions or dense forests, very swampy areas. And the existence of maroon societies challenged the social, political, and economic structures of colonial powers. And you had some communities that existed for a few years, and others persisted for centuries. In some countries, especially in South America, for example, in Brazil, Colombia, you have descendants of Maroons that still live in semi-autonomous societies, although they're increasingly under siege. Um, you find marronage, that the practice of people escaping plantations, escaping enslavement, happening all across the Atlantic, all across the Americas, from the Great Dismal Swamp here in the United States, which covers Virginia and North Carolina, across the Carolinas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, to South America, I already mentioned Brazil, Colombia, Suriname, to the Caribbean, Jamaica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic. And what I'm part of what I'm trying to do in this talk and in work that I'm going to build off of this talk is to bring more of the experience of marronage on the African continent into this scholarship. So there is not much scholarship on the practice of marronage in Africa, although it did happen. People were held in captivity, awaiting transport across the Atlantic, and often did escape, and sometimes to the hinterlands, sometimes integrating into the cities and towns around slave ports. So I want to bring that conversation into this larger scholarship on marronage. But there's been a traditional focus on rural communities and their escape from plantations, but increasingly people are using marronage to look at other forms of resistance, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And so some of how the scholarship has evolved is that shift in looking at marronage or escape and resistance from rural to what does that look like in urban settings. Also, the scholarship has evolved to focus on modern day implications of marronage in cities, rather, and then connecting Black geographies to ecological resistance. So over time, the scholarship on marronage has expanded beyond rural areas to consider urban settings, and researchers are now exploring the tactics of resistance and autonomy that are employed by communities both in the past, in the present, and especially in response to exclusionary policies and environmental challenges. And so some key concepts we're going to be looking at are how marronage intersects with Black geographies, which are frameworks that focus on how marginalized communities resist and adapt using ecological knowledge to survive in hostile environments. Scholars like James Scott and others have connected maroon strategies of retreat to out of the way places like swamps, forests, and mountainous regions, to contemporary practices of oppressed groups who flee state tyranny and surveillance and control, and flee to what Jamal White calls unruly environments, but which offer alternative spaces for creating community and safety. So let's talk about the transnational connections and why putting Nigeria and the US into context. So two of the reasons are right on the screen. As I mentioned, marronage in the African context, and trying to understand how ecological knowledge has been preserved across regions. We know that key to the survival of maroon societies was being able to live in the forests, in the swamps. And so relying on the knowledge of livelihoods from Africa and being able to use that in the New World while also adapting to new surroundings, as well as the shared histories of displacement and resistance that continue to this day in a global context of anti-Blackness. So the cases today are going to focus on those transnational connections between what we see in Nigeria and what can be found in the American South, in historic swamps, say around New Orleans, or in the environmental justice struggles of Cancer Alley. And by examining those shared histories of displacement and resistance, we can bridge gaps in Black geographies and ecologies with the context of marronage on the African continent. And the whole idea is for this comparison is to understand how these different strategies evolve in different places, and what are the similarities and what might be some of the differences and the implications of those. So why urban environmental marronage? So urban marronage, as I mentioned, extends the historical concept into contemporary urban settings, right? So going from creating, fleeing the plantation, fleeing bondage, to live in remote areas that were hard to reach. What is the parallel of that today in creating autonomous spaces of resistance within cities, often in response to exclusionary urban policies and development practices? And then environmental marronage is around those survival mechanisms in hostile environments that require ecological adaptation, as well as cultural preservation, both of which are crucial for environmental justice for communities. Right. So I wanted to just pause for a minute to talk about marronage as both method and practice, where we bridge theory and action. And so I'm drawing on kind of four different approaches that are used in the literature and scholarship on marronage. So abolition, geography, and ecology. So if we think about it, marronage is as a method involves decolonizing the way we understand resistance and even the way we approach and understand the archive. When it comes to abolition geography, Ruthie Gilmore defines it by starting with a spatial understanding of social justice and the idea that freedom is a place, and talking about people, the bonds among us, and how we organize, as well as use resources to shape our environments. And then Nick Hanen and Hardin extend this concept using political ecology to critically think about land in that equation. Then we talk about decolonizing the archive is a really important part of marronage scholarship, because a lot of, in the American South, for example, they didn't even want to use the term maroons. There was a lot people knew by way of how news spread across the Americas that you had these large maroon societies in the Caribbean and South America, and plantation owners in the South didn't want that same kind of mythos developing in the U.S. South. And so a lot of maroon society is obscured in the archive, and it relies on the passage down of oral history and traditions and a lot of ethnographic work, as well as the using clues from what is in the archive, what is in maps, to fill in the blanks. Even archaeology comes into play here. There are teams of archaeologists who are going now into the Dismal Swamp and uncovering and digging up artifacts from maroon societies that once lived there. I have an image here on this slide of one of my dear colleagues who's a professor of history at UC Riverside, Ademide Adelusi, and her work involves restoring Lagosians to the colonial archive. So if you look at maps of old Lagos, they're the only visible parts of the maps are what's relevant to the colonizers, it's the ports, right, and their buildings and their structures, and the tens of thousands of people who live there, and all the communities and the residents and the daily life. All of that is invisible and missing from old maps from the archive. And so what she does is use present day artifacts, GIS, and what is available in the archive, as well as what's been passed down with oral history and in poetry, to reconstruct maps that put people back into history. And so that's a really powerful method in Marronage research. So really capturing the lived experience of communities. And then speculative Black geographies is important for providing a framework for imagining futures free of oppression and environmental exploitation. And that connects to Moulton and Solo's framing of Black geographies as insurgent eco criticism. So we can use the past to inform present day ecological and urban struggles, bridging scholarship with activism. In the piece, Feeling, Thinking the Archive, Participatory Mapping Marronage, scholar Ana Laura Zavala-Guillen notes that Latin American territories have been politically constructed as white mestizo spaces, erasing the presence of Afro-descendant and indigenous people and their legacies. In Colombia, these racialized groups are known as the other Colombia. And so in her work, she uses a decolonial participatory method to map the geography of descendants of fugitives from slavery, combining the existing archives and extensive oral history of maroon descendants. And she says, quote, feeling, thinking about dispossession and resistance while counter using the colonial archive to reclaim Afro-descendant history is a subversive undertaking, one that is ingrained in the legacy of maroon resistance. And so even doing maroon scholarship embodies the spirit and the legacy of Marronage. Okay, so today I'll mostly focus on maroon ecologies in Nigeria, as I mentioned, with reference to the Americas, and focusing on how distinct regions have developed strategies to resist ecological and spatial oppression. I do want to acknowledge that the idea for connecting the scholarship I've been doing in Nigeria with the concept of marronage was really inspired by travel this past summer, where I had the good fortune to participate in the Black Ecologies Summer Field School in New Orleans, Louisiana, with my colleague, Justin Hosby, who co-organizes it with JT Rohn, who's at Rutgers. And the field school focused on themes of educational infrastructure in the post-Katrina context, historical and contemporary forms of marronage, waterscapes, and carceral ecologies. We were able to meet with community partners in the lower Ninth Ward, Algiers, Clackamas Parish, as well as tour maroon sites on New Orleans' West Bank. And we learned, for example, how older houses constructed with mangroves were able to withstand a lot of the damage from Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of that knowledge and practice of how to work with mangroves, which is a direct knowledge transferred from the African context to the Americas, has been lost. But there is the story in the community of how these much older houses actually were able to fare better with the flooding. Judith Carney, in talking about that kind of place-based knowledge that transfers, from one region to another, specifically talking about mangrove swamplands, which were marginal to European territorialization during the colonial period, versus African and Afro-descendant placemaking. So on both sides of the Atlantic, the environment that Europeans feared provided Africans with food, basic necessities, as well as refuge from slavery. And Justin and JT have written about this idea of maroon ecologies in their work on the dual histories of racial slavery and environmental degradation in the Tidewater region of Virginia and the Mississippi Delta. Their work, A Totally Different Form of Living, on the Legacies of Displacement and Marronage as Black Ecologies, they argue that during slavery, swamps, bayous, rivers, and wetlands were geographies in which a fleeing Black commons could be sustained and hidden away from the violence of the plantation. The problem is, at the same time, those same ecologies are now under extreme duress, whether it's coastal subsidence, whether it's toxics from the petrochemical industry, climate change, or the pressures of displacement. Those ecologies that once provided refuge are now under attack. And so their project is to chart cultural, spiritual, intellectual, and practical insights from Black Southern communities to understand alternative ecological practice that come out of the kind of imaginaries around Marronage. And so in that spirit, I'm engaging in this today. So I wanted to, I'll start the first two places we'll go to today are Badagry, as I mentioned, the former slave port, and Lagos, which has its current name, used to be called Echo by the indigenous Yoruba, but was named Lagos by the Portuguese for lakes, and today is popularly known as Lagos among the people of Nigeria. And so you see that on the map here. So they're near each other, and technically Badagry is part of the larger urban agglomeration that is Lagos. And both sites are part of the huge urban corridor that is West Africa, that's home to 70 million people, and is a kind of continuous expanse that goes from Lagos all the way to Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire. So let's go into our first case. So let's talk about Badagry. So I've written about Badagry, and it's a beautiful place in Nigeria. It's not as well known among the former slave ports as, say, sites in Ghana or like Elmina Castle or Gorée Island in Senegal. There's a kind of undeveloped feel to it that is, the first time I went, it was quite emotional because you could almost feel as if you were taken back in time. But what's remarkable about Badagry is that this is a town where people families that used to be involved in the slave trade illegally, kept some of the artifacts, the chains, all the metals, the leg braces, the irons, all the things that were used to enslave Africans, and have over time have turned those into a thriving tourism industry that mostly Nigerians from other parts of Nigeria come to. There's not as much of an international tourism destination in Badagry, although it's starting to become known, and people do visit. Evander Holyfield has been there, and other well-known Americans have been there as well, and they're actively trying to build partnerships with African Americans as well. But they've preserved a kind of homegrown cultural tourism. Local youth will take you on canoes, and you can even follow and walk for hours the same route that formerly enslaved Africans had to walk in the journey from capture from the barracoons to the ships. What's happening now, though, although that they've developed this thriving kind of cultural tourism based on this preservation of heritage, the state is moving in. Now Badagry is seen as a site for redevelopment. There's plans for a Badagry marina, and bringing lots of boats and recreation, and no discussion or mention of the indigenous community that has protected and preserved this history, that holds festivals, that passes down oral tradition. And in fact, the state has built their own museum. And when I took my students there last in 2019, and anybody who goes there, there's actually a very very spirited competition, in terms of who is going to take a given group on the tour, and to see and to follow go to the point of no return, and do the walk and go on the boats and see the artifacts. I always take my students to the Moby Slave Relic Museum, which is one of the families that have kept their relics and that are now, they're now part of an abolition movement, but also part of preserving cultural heritage. So the interesting thing is that the redevelopment in Badagry is being done in the name of climate change and protecting the coast. And it's about protecting the land, but not necessarily the people. So in Badagry, we see a modern form of marronage where local communities assert control over their historical narratives, and as well as cultural heritage. And this, I feel, reflects how maroon communities historically developed their own cultures and systems of governance, and that these preservation efforts represent a form of cultural marronage, and maintaining autonomy and resisting kind of external appropriation of history. So I just want to take you through a few slides just so you can see. This is a monument that you can find, and once you complete the voyage of the Walk of No Return, and you stop at these different stations where there's wells where the enslaved were drugged to keep them docile to load them onto ships. At the end, now there's this large monument, the Iron of Liberty, at Berefu Beach, at Badagry. And this spot served as the official marker of where large slave ships waited on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean centuries earlier to lead millions from life in the West African interior to the Americas. And as I mentioned, this site was also a contested site where hostilities broke out between representatives from the Lagos State Badagry Heritage Museum, who claimed to organize the official tour, and descendants of the local slave trading family who felt that the state had usurped their rightful role. And at stake was who is going to tell the story, the real story of Badagry. And so embedded in that small moment that happened with my students was a conflict over meaning and the goals of heritage preservation, and high stakes, with climate change impacting the coast and these plans for coastal adaptation. This is just a picture inside the Moby Slave Relic Museum. And you can see down below in the image are some of the actual chains on display that were used, and they actually let you hold them. You can feel how heavy they were. It's a very visceral experience. So over time, the effort to memorialize the endurance of enslaved Africans in the town itself has become a strategy of resilience, as the local community has embraced heritage tourism for economic development. At the same time that local sustainability is threatened by both the lack of infrastructure and services and coastal erosion that the state is trying to address with this plan, this is a rendering of what the redevelopment of the Badagry Marina would look like when it's completed. And this is another image of it. And what's striking to people in Badagry is how little of it reflects, the heritage of slavery or, that memory. It's very much geared towards kind of high-end tourism and recreation. And so this is an ongoing struggle. And before we leave Badagry, just wanted to share a quote from the chief, one of the chiefs of the area, and Bale is another word for chief, who is complaining about discrimination despite the fact that they're taxpayers. And he says, when he was interviewed, he says, "If you go around the community, you will see that my people have developed distrust for the government. Every tax imposed on people living on the mainland is also applicable to us, and we've been paying to both the state and the local government. It is like they are waiting for us all to die." And he goes on to describe how far people must travel for healthcare, for water from government boreholes that barely function, the lack of electricity, the lack of teachers, and so forth. And so he's describing, the dire circumstances faced by the community. And so they're really the economy around preservation of culture and this history of the slave trade is really one of survival that is under threat, paradoxically, by this strategy of protecting the coast that the state is leading. Next, I want to take you, and I'm sorry, I want to take you to all these places in Nigeria. We're going very quickly, but hopefully we'll have more time during the Q&A and discussion, and have future opportunities to talk. So each of these cases is really rich, and so much more could be shared. So I want to go to Lagos in terms of the metropolitan area, the center of Lagos, which was once an Awori Yoruba fishing village of 5,000 people. The largest cities in Nigeria pre-colonial were in the interior along rivers like Ibadan, it was only with the slave trade and with the extraction of Nigeria's natural resources that the coasts and the ports became important. And now you have a city in Lagos that is, a mega city pushing 20 million people, one of the largest cities in the world, very strained in terms of being able to provide clean water, sanitation, energy to such a massive population. And amid all of this in Lagos, you have a massive amount of what are called informal settlements. And I know that term is problematic because when governments tend to talk about informal settlements, they tend to focus on the informality of the poor and not the informality of the wealthy who are building, say, without permits in ways that, you know, make areas more prone to flood and actually can cause more problems for people with less secure and sturdy housing. So, but I am talking about the informality of the poor in terms of looking at Marronage in the Lagosian context. So, and we're also going to talk about Eco-Atlantic, which introduces another wrinkle in this context. And I want to show some pictures of Eco-Atlantic. Like I said, it's this massive development where they're reclaiming land off the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Victoria Island, about 3/4 the size of Manhattan. And plans for it to be fully electrified, water flowing 24 a day, high rises. Chevron was the first to buy a plot. It's building slowly but surely. So the last time I took my students there, about 6 of the high rises had been built, but they are going up, and the development has like a 200-year lease on the land, and so it is being built. The question is the pressure that development is putting on the waterfront communities and causing massive displacement, which is being enforced by the state government in violent ways. When I talk about Lagos and Nigeria in general, I do have to bring up Fela Kuti, who was an amazing, not just an artist, an Afrobeat pioneer, not the current Afrobeats of that's very popular right now with Burna Boy and Davido and all of that, which is wonderful music. But this is the original Afrobeat music, and one of my favorite songs, "Water No Get Enemy," because the focus of my dissertation was on clean water and access to water. And Fela was one to bring the struggles of the people into his music. And in fact, his mother was also an activist and was killed by the military dictatorship. So Fela was very militant, and his music inspired millions of Nigerians. I think it was gonna. Okay, there's a little piece of it. Okay, I don't have time to listen, but hopefully that little piece encourages you to go look up Fela's music for yourself. So usually when you see Lagos, you'll see images like this. This is from a BBC article, "The Lagoon Metropolis." Lagos is notorious for the growing population, the infrastructure challenges, and as well as the practices of state, sanctioned land capture, particularly from waterfront communities who, engage in fishing livelihoods, uh, you know, sand dredging, all kinds of, and contribute to the society, are productive members of Lagos society, but they live on land that's highly coveted. And so the government is in the business of forcibly illegally evicting, according to the courts, people off the land, even though they have traditional rights and have lived there for centuries. Many of the people that live on the waterfront community are actually immigrants from other parts of West Africa who've settled and negotiated land tenure with traditional authorities. And those rights have been upheld by courts, but not respected by the Lagos government. So you have that happening. So it's the most populated state, but the land is the smallest of Nigeria's states. And so the state is in this business of taking land from people. This is from a visual artwork by Wura Natasha Gunji, a well-known Nigerian artist. And this was part of a studio that me and a colleague, Ivy Mills from History of Art, took students to in 2019, where we were looking at both the role of art and planning this green city from below. And in Lagos, visual representation plays a central role in struggles over land and competing visions of Lagos' future, visions that impact planning practice and people's livelihoods in concrete ways. So on one hand, you have the state investing in public art as part of the megacity project that's like Eco Atlantic, that's supposed to bring foreign investment, and it's, you know, top-down development, and critics describe it as eco-gentrification on a grand scale. And then you have more grassroots kind of artists that are more about protest and pushing back on the conditions. So in this piece, where Natasha Ogunji is commenting on the struggle of women having to collect water, because essentially women are they are the pipes of the city. When the city doesn't care enough to invest in providing clean water to everyone and investing in the infrastructure for that, it's women who actually have to carry water through the city to their homes and to their families. This is an image of one of the waterfront communities after their homes had been bulldozed by the government. And the New York Times called the people in the photo homeless, but they're not homeless. Their homes are being destroyed, and they were illegally evicted. So contrast that with Eco Atlantic. So on the left, this is a rendering of the Marina District, which is the central planned development of Eco Atlantic. And then I have a series of satellite images so you can see, you know, how that massive infilling that's happening off the coast of Nigeria. This project won a Clinton Global Initiative Award, again, done in the name of addressing climate change and coastal erosion, but a very elite driven development. There are plans for 24/7 infrastructure. Nowhere else is this being planned in the city. And this whole project is being conceived as a futuristic city, the financial epicenter of West Africa, you know, being built on this reclaimed land that's supposed to be land that used to be part of Lagos, so it used to be public land. And then the reality on the ground are these waterfront communities. Here you see some of the communities that are engaged in logging along the waterfront, that are under threat because of developments like Eco Atlantic and the scarcity of land. And so it's really a tale of two cities. You know, the luxury development and a focus on elite on the other hand, and the struggles of people. This is on the left is a photo I took in Badia, Lagos, one of the areas that are considered blighted. That's the word used in Lagos for what the UN would call slums, areas without adequate water, sanitation, you know, durable housing, and where tenure is insecure. And about 70% of people in Lagos are living on less than $2 a day. And so in past, I've talked about this as, you know, part of infrastructural violence, which we can talk about in more detail. And this image is showing, this was one of the waterfront communities we visited, and we visited an area that was now all luxury mansions and infill, and it used to be waterfront, and it used to be a community of thousands of fishing villages that lived on the water. And the community is a Toto Gabame. And there's a movement in Lagos called #SaveTheWaterfronts. And what happened here was really tragic. On the morning of April 9th, 2017, the community was awoken by armed police who fired guns and tear gas, set fire to homes, forced children, women, elderly to flee, many into the lagoon where they drowned. And 5,000 people were forced to leave their possessions behind. And even though they've won court battles, they've not been able to return. And so you have groups like the Nigerian Slum Settlement Federation working with justice and empowerment initiatives, fighting to reclaim this land and this territory and resettling. So they, what is remarkable is the amount of community and the kind of Black commons that's created in this process. So rather than people being displaced and then just, whether it's going back to other parts of Nigeria or to other countries, other waterfront communities have taken in everyone who's been displaced. And each time another community is displaced, another waterfront community will take them in, even though they have very little resources themselves. So that was very powerful to see, when we were able to visit Makoko with justice and empowerment initiatives. And this is one of my favorite photos taken by a former student who is part of this studio of women who engage in what they call profiling. Profiling is a positive thing in the Nigerian context, where it's all about putting your community on the map. And so they use satellite imagery and then go to door and literally map each house in each community, and who lives there, and do they go to school, and their economy, and use that to advocate for land and for tenure and for rights. I don't have much time to go into the Niger Delta, but I do want to talk about it because it is an important site of environmental marronage and environmental justice in the Nigerian context. So here we see environmental marronage manifested through in several ways, through multi-stakeholder governance, where there are new models that are emerging after decades of not only protests, but militant action, kidnappings, violence, against oil companies. Oil companies have conceded to this new form of government called setting up global memorandas of understanding with different communities in the Niger Delta. And I should mention the Niger Delta is a region of 9 states, of tens of millions of people. So it crosses 9 states, tens of millions of people living in, not in some in urban areas, but traditionally living in the creeks and the swamps, of the Delta, because that's where they engaged in traditional livelihood. But as oil production and done in the worst and most irresponsible and reckless way, abetted in many ways by the government, people's water, the forests have been polluted, have been destroyed. And so more people have been living in cities as a result. But you do have some elements of resistance, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So you see, environmental justice activism as marronage in the Niger Delta. And as part of this are strategies of self-governance, collective resource management, and this negotiating with the oil companies directly. The government is very little involved. It's really directly between communities in the Delta and the oil companies. And they've been able to negotiate to get money to pay for infrastructure and things like that. Women have been a critical part of mobilizing in the Niger Delta. And they've been a key part of creating more peace, for it not to just be violence and kidnapping, but really protesting and securing gains in terms of representation and governance and things like that. And the transformative role of women in the Delta really aligns with narratives of women in maroon societies who play crucial roles in community resilience and creating communities of care, which themselves are radical politics of resistance, and underscores the importance of gender also in looking at strategies of marronage in both the historic and contemporary context. And the last image I want to leave you with of the Niger Delta is just to talk about alternative socio-ecological systems. Right now, when people talk about the Delta, a big focus is on oil bunkering, which is where militant groups will siphon oil from the massive oil pipes that crisscross the region and, set up kind of their own alternative refineries. And, the government is really interested in Shell and Chevron and all the other companies are interested in stamping out this activity. But another way to see it is as a way of securing their own livelihoods, their own, autonomy, in stealing fuel from these large multinational oil companies and engaging in bunkering directly and getting money. And that you even have other countries that come off the coast of Nigeria, and you have communities trading directly with other countries to get foreign currency, which then filter into the communities. They get more from this activity than they ever get from the state government. So these kinds of alternative socio-ecological practices. On one lens, it's cracked down just in the same way that during the time of slavery, Marronage, escaped slaves, and was seen as something illegal and to crack down on, and they were always trying to destroy these maroon societies and maroon communities. Although some were able to withstand those tactics and actually engage in trade and build some kind of normal relationship with the surrounding societies. But in general, the state wanted to crack down, plantation owners wanted to crack down. And so again, we see this kind of parallels in the kind of illegal or illicit activity in strategies of survival. So with the last few slides, I just want to talk about the legacies of Marronage and Maroon society in the Americas. And so by comparing ecological and spatial resistance strategies across Nigeria and the Americans, we can gain insight into how these legacies influence contemporary environmental justice movements. And so Marronage and the study of it has evolved, but it seems really relevant to understanding today's urban struggles and offering kind of new frameworks for thinking about resilience and resistance. I can't do justice to this topic fully here, and that's what the larger project is. Kind of to look more at how the instances of Marronage in the African context and bring that into the scholarship, as well as bring different practices to really do comparative analysis, to bring different practices of Marronage, both historically and contemporary, across the continent and the diaspora. But there's some concepts here that I want to leave you with, which, Marronage as resistance, not just physical resistance. So traditionally, that's what it meant, right? Flight from slavery, flight from the plantation, but it's also metaphorical or ideological escape from various forms of oppression. Another key concept that comes from thinking about Marronage in the Americas that I'm eager to look at in the African context are the geographies of Marronage and this idea of geographic refuse, which is all about making a way out of no way, or transforming spaces that are undesirable or inaccessible by dominant society into sites of freedom and self-determination. And I even see that in my work currently, especially since the pandemic. I've been doing more work in California on environmental justice, and most recently working in East Oakland, California, which used to have, be a large site of the African American community in Oakland, but people are being displaced and pushed out. There's a lot of the way East Oakland is characterized in terms of dangerous or all kinds of things, negative characterizations. But when you talk to people who live there, it's vibrant, it's culture, it's home, and in a way, that narrative, that larger narrative, in some ways serves to protect people, and people are able to make space and create their own space in that larger context. So I'm even seeing parallels in that. Fugitive infrastructures and the Black Commons. So fugitive infrastructures is about understanding how Black communities create and maintain their own systems of care, governance, and resource management. We see that in Lagos, where informal settlements have to provide their own water, their own electricity, their own services, but also in the Niger Delta, where people are engaging in their own oil refining illegally. And Black cooperative placemaking as well is part of this. And then lastly, strategic entanglement. So Marronage is not only about fleeing or escaping, it's also about strategically engaging with the dominant society, much as groups today have to think about how do we engage with the larger society and still, keep our place to say, how do we demand more from our government to clean up our environment, say for environmental justice, without getting pushed out of our community? So strategic entanglement. So these are concepts that can be put into conversation. I won't go into, there's lots of implications for urban theory that Marronage speaks to by bringing, uh, you know, maroon ecologies, Black ecologies into urban studies and environmental studies as well. I want to leave you with two images. So one, this is an image by Olalekan Jeyufu's Shanty Megastructures. He's commonly known as Lek. He's a Nigerian-born visual artist out of Brooklyn, New York. And he's known for works like this, which transform shanty dwellings into sleek high-rise towers. And so in this image, the dispossessed are given prominence and visibility through these large towers made of patchwork materials. And to me, this image really symbolizes the idea of Marronage. And he created it to highlight the deep divide in socioeconomic inequality. But it also provokes series of questions that have guided my work in Lagos and some studios that I've had in the past taking students there, where, to question the common sense understanding of urban informality in the African context, to look for infrastructure, not only in roads and water, but in people, social relations, and popular urban aesthetics, to listen to the voices of community members who are reimagining a future for African cities that doesn't impose an outside bourgeois vision on what a well-planned green city should look like, and to ask, how might the future city look if the beautiful green city is imagined and planned from below? So I'll leave it there. This idea of transatlantic Black ecologies, there's both continuity in looking at the past, but also transformation of this concept as we look at how it continues to evolve over time. And so I would say that, today's exploration shows how marginalized communities can create autonomy and resist environmental challenges in cities, and by connecting Black ecologies from the coast of Nigeria to the American South, we can see how those Marronage strategies continue to evolve in contemporary social and environmental justice movements, and really highlighting opportunities for solidarity across the Black Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charisma. That's particularly poignant for me, when you mentioned the slave castles. I visited Elmina Castle in my father's country of Ghana, and it's a kind of bucket list experience in many ways, but it is one of the most moving things, I think, when you see the Gates of No Return, and you can feel centuries of souls, uneasy souls.
Absolutely.
Anybody who wants to experience the worst side of humanity, I think, going to these slave castles. But there's an uplift to them as well. Hey, we've got about 2 minutes, and I want to bring in Bobby Jones. Bobby lives in Georgia, and he says, listening from Georgia, I would love to hear Charisma's thoughts on the Gullah Geechee culture and how it is part of or distinct from the larger context history of Marronage, particularly with the recent disaster on Sapelo Island.
Yeah, I really have to first of all just acknowledge the tragedy that just happened, and send all of us send our prayers to all of the people impacted and the survivors. And yeah, the Gullah Geechee are a part of this project that I plan to continue to explore. But they're a remarkable community that has really preserved a lot of actively preserved the culture and even the dialect and way of speaking of the West African context, and actively preserved and maintained those traditions. And yet, those, just like in other parts of the South, their land is under siege. There's a lot of effort currently underway to push people off the land, similar to the way black people are being and vulnerable people are being pushed off of land in other places all around the world. This is happening to the Gullah Geechee. And so while they've done this remarkable, amazing job of preserving culture and tradition and heritage, it is under threat. And it's been a process that's been ongoing. And so I think there's a lot to learn from the strategies. And I think that's some implications for practice, right? How do we support communities and see that as part of planning practice, say, in terms of preserving heritage and preserving culture as a political act.
Great, Charisma. Can we all give a Cities at Tufts warm thank you to Dr. Charisma Acey from Berkeley? Fantastic presentation, Charisma.
Thank you so much, Julian. Sorry I didn't leave more time for questions.
Well, I suspect you're going to get some emails, and Charisma tells me, a lot of this is coming out in a book over the next year or so. So keep an eye out for Charisma's work. Our next colloquium is next Wednesday, October 30th, where we'll hear from Jose Aviles from the Othering and Belonging Institute, also, I believe, at Berkeley, and he'll talk about reimagining urban planning. So stay safe, and we'll see you all next week for Jose Aviles talk. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.